In the endless grim darkness of the 41st millennium, monsters are not rare. But there is one creature spoken of in hushed tones, even by those hardened to war, that embodies a particular terror. Its name is spoken as both a curse and a warning: Old One-Eye. Amongst the horrors of the Tyranid swarms, Old One-Eye stands apart. The Tyranids are a species designed for efficiency, each organism engineered for a specific purpose. The Carnifex class of bioform, towering, heavily armored, and monstrously strong, is bred to break enemy lines, demolish fortifications, and reduce armored columns to scrap. But Old One-Eye is not merely a Carnifex. It is something more: a mutation, a legend, a nightmare. Its name comes from the ruin of its face. Where its left eye should sit, there is only a hollow crater, burned and blackened, as if some catastrophic wound once sought to end its existence. But it survived that wound, as it has survived countless others. That single blazing right eye has glared from the smoke of battlefields across the Imperium for centuries, a beacon of death and destruction. Its origins are traced back to the First Tyrannic War. When Hive Fleet Behemoth descended upon the realm of Ultramar, billions died beneath the swarm's advance. Entire worlds were devoured. It was during these early stages of the Tyranid onslaught that Old One-Eye first made itself known, leading swarms of chittering gaunts and lumbering bio-titans on the planet of Calth. The defenders who faced it described a beast even more terrifying than the horrors surrounding it. A massive Carnifex that waded into battle with an unnatural fury, tearing through ranks of guardsmen and space marines alike as though they were paper. Where other Carnifexes followed instinct, Old One-Eye seemed driven by a singular, almost personal rage. Leman Russ battle tanks opened fire, but their shells bounced harmlessly off its impossibly thick carapace. Plasma bursts and crack missiles tore into its flanks, but still it advanced. Its monstrous claws, like the pincers of some titanic crustacean, smashed through armor plating with contemptuous ease, ripping apart tanks, bunkers, and men alike. It shattered the fortified lines that were meant to hold Calth. Every attempt to halt its advance ended with crushed defenses and scattered bodies. What terrified the defenders most, however, was not its size or its power, but its resilience. Every time Old One-Eye was struck down, it rose again. Bolter fire severed limbs, only for them to regrow. Explosive shells gouged open its chest, only for its chitinous plates to knit together moments later. Its wounds closed as fast as they were inflicted, and sometimes faster. The beast did not retreat. It did not falter. It fought with the relentlessness of the hive mind's will, but with a singular resilience that none had seen before. It earned its name when, in the midst of its rampage, an Imperial hero, whose name is lost to time, managed to land a perfect shot from a plasma pistol into the creature's face. The blast annihilated the Carnifex's left eye, scorching deep into its brain. For the first time, the beast staggered. For the first time, it fell. The mighty Carnifex crashed to the ground, its bulk slamming into the ruined landscape of Calth like a dying god. The defenders dared to believe that the nightmare was over. Yet even as its carcass lay cooling, those who survived spoke of a dread certainty that such a creature could not be truly dead. For long years, the people of Calth lived under that shadow. The body of Old One-Eye remained, too massive to move and too dangerous to approach. It froze into the planet's southern ice fields, preserved by the cold, locked in a tomb of blue ice. Soldiers stationed nearby told stories of its eye still glowing faintly beneath the frozen surface, as if watching. Superstition took hold. Some said that in the silence of night one could hear the ice crack as the beast shifted within its prison. The Adeptus Mechanicus debated whether to retrieve the creature for study, while the Administratum simply preferred to classify it as dead, unwilling to risk provoking the monster. But rumors persisted. There were those who believed it was not truly dead, that the regenerative monstrosity simply slumbered, healing itself in the cold embrace of the ice. It was not the first Tyranid organism to demonstrate terrifying regenerative powers, but never before had such abilities been seen on this scale. Magos biologists, who studied the data, theorized that Old One-Eye was some kind of aberration, an experimental strain of Carnifex, perhaps engineered by the hive mind to test new adaptations. The hive fleets are known to absorb the genetic memory of every battle, evolving with each encounter. Old One-Eye, then, might have been one of their first attempts at creating a truly unkillable shock unit. And yet, even by the standards of the Tyranids, its resilience was unnatural. As time passed, Old One-Eye's name spread far beyond Kalth. It became a cautionary tale told across Ultramar and beyond, a warning to any commander facing the Tyranids. If ever you see a Carnifex with a single burning eye, do not hesitate. Do not assume it's death. Attack with overwhelming force and pray it stays dead. Across the Imperium, from naval officers to planetary governors, from Hive City spire lords to trench-grimed guardsmen, the name Old One-Eye carries with it a particular dread. Not merely because of its past rampages, but because of what it represents. The Tyranids' capacity for ceaseless evolution and their terrifying mastery over life and death. For even monsters have limits, but Old One-Eye, it seems, does not. The planet of Kalth had long stood as one of the proud jewels in the realm of Ultramar. Fertile lands, thriving cities, and vast industrial complexes dotted its surface. It was a world of loyal citizens, efficient governance, and stable prosperity under the vigilant eye of the Ultramarines. For generations, Kalth was a shining example of what the Imperium could achieve when order triumphed over chaos. Its people lived under the protection of the Emperor's finest warriors, never imagining the nightmare that would soon descend from the stars. The Tyranids came without warning. Hive Fleet Behemoth surged into Ultramar like a living tide of destruction, its bioships blotting out the void as they moved inexorably toward the core worlds. As Ultramar's defenses mobilized to meet the threat, Kalth became one of the first major worlds to face the swarm's fury head-on. In the early hours of the invasion, the sky itself appeared to split open. Countless mycetic spores rained from orbit, punching through the atmosphere like meteoric bombardment. Each impact crater birthed waves of Tyranid organisms, hormagaunts, termagants, genestealers, and towering monstrosities bred for war. The surface of Kalth became a feeding ground as the initial waves swept through outlying settlements, devouring all in their path. The defenders fought bravely. The PDF regiments, well trained by Ultramar's high standards, mobilized within hours. They erected defensive lines, manned bastions, and dug in for a siege unlike any they had faced before. The Ultramarines deployed from orbit, their drop pods slamming into the surface amidst the chaos. Veterans of countless campaigns, these warriors had faced Tyranids before, but never on this scale. At first, the defenders managed to contain the smaller broods, cutting down waves of gaunts as they charged. Bolters roared, Lascannons fired, and artillery batteries rained shells upon the alien hordes. The ground shook as Baneblades and Leman Russ tanks rolled into position, their heavy guns carving swathes through the oncoming Xenos. But the Tyranids adapted with terrifying speed. Synapse creatures directed the swarms with surgical precision, exploiting every weakness, every gap, every hesitation. And then, amidst this brutal melee, it appeared. The first sightings of the Carnifex were met with awe and dread. Where ordinary Carnifexes were already terrifying war beasts, this one seemed impossibly large, even by their standards. Its chitinous plates gleamed like obsidian in the fires of war, and its great claws flexed as though eager to rend metal and flesh alike. It charged through the front lines, crushing barricades and fortifications as if they were made of paper. With each thunderous step, the ground cracked beneath its weight. The defenders had never seen anything move like it. Most Carnifexes lumbered, relying on sheer power and momentum to crush their foes. But this one was different. Fast, agile, terrifyingly precise. Its movements were calculated, almost intelligent, as if it sought out the greatest concentrations of resistance simply to annihilate them in displays of overwhelming force. The siege lines broke wherever it struck. At Fort Resolute, one of the strongest defensive bastions on Calth, the defenders prepared to make a stand. The PDF's finest regiments were stationed there, supported by several squadrons of Leman Russ tanks and a detachment of Ultramarines led by Captain Lorcan. For hours they held against the waves, cutting down countless gaunts and repelling Genestealer infiltrations. Then the seismic sensors detected the approach of something massive. Old One Eye descended upon Fort Resolute with the fury of a living god of war. Its impact shattered the outer walls in seconds. The first Leman Russ to fire never got a second shot. Its turret was ripped clean off and hurled into a squad of infantry, crushing them instantly. Another tank was overturned with a casual swipe of the creature's massive claw. The remaining defenders poured fire into the beast from every direction: plasma, melta, heavy bolters. But the Carnifex shrugged off the assault as though it were little more than rain. The Ultramarines coordinated a counteroffensive, aiming for its exposed underbelly, targeting the vulnerable joints where its massive limbs connected to its armored torso. Tactical squads moved with discipline, firing concentrated volleys while Devastators unleashed salvos of heavy weaponry. For a brief moment, the beast staggered. But then, before their eyes, its wounds closed. Chitin regrew. Torn sinews knit themselves together. The plasma burns faded into nothing as fresh armor plates pushed up through its ruined flesh. It was as though the very act of wounding the beast only made it more determined, more enraged. Within minutes, the inner walls of Fort Resolute collapsed. The defenders were overrun. Captain Lorcan, wielding his power sword with masterful precision, engaged the beast directly, striking at its ruined eye, seeking a weakness. For a moment his blade bit deep, sending up a spray of ichor. But the Carnifex roared, rearing up and slamming him into the ground with a bone-crushing impact. Lorcan's armor crumpled like parchment beneath its weight. The survivors fled into the lower levels, sealing blast doors behind them. Above, Old One Eye rampaged freely, destroying all that remained of Fort Resolute. Its bellowing roars echoed across the battlefield, a sound that chilled even the Ultramarines to their core. They had faced many horrors before, but none that defied destruction so completely. Elsewhere on the planet, similar scenes unfolded. Wherever resistance was strongest, Old One Eye was drawn like a predator to wounded prey. Imperial Guard convoys vanished overnight. Supply lines were torn apart. Vox transmissions filled with screams before cutting off abruptly. Forward operating bases were reduced to smoking craters, their garrison defenders crushed or dismembered. As the hours turned into days, fear spread across Calth like wildfire. Stories of the unkillable Carnifex circulated among the troops. Some whispered that it was not of this galaxy at all, but a demon made flesh. Others insisted it was the will of the hive mind given singular purpose, a creature designed not to kill, but to humiliate humanity by showing the futility of resistance. Even as the main hive fleet devoured other worlds, Old One Eye remained focused on Calth, as though drawn to that world by some terrible fate. Its actions were not random. It struck at key points of defense, crippling Calth's ability to coordinate its planetary defense network. Vox relays, orbital defense uplinks, even civilian evacuation hubs all became targets of its fury. The Imperial High Command issued multiple kill orders for the creature, designating it as a priority target, but every attempt to eliminate it failed. Heavy weapon teams were torn apart before they could bring their guns to bear. Airstrikes failed to track its rapid movement through the ruins. Artillery shells rained down upon its last known locations, only to find that the beast had moved on, leaving nothing but carnage in its wake. In time, the defense of Calth shifted from open battle to desperate survival. Commanders began diverting troops to avoid confrontations with the monster altogether, focusing instead on delaying the broader Tyranid advance. The name Old One-Eye was added to every battle report, marked in crimson as a persistent, uncontained threat. Throughout the siege, one truth became undeniable. This was no ordinary Tyranid. It was a singular horror that made even seasoned veterans question whether victory was possible. Old One-Eye had become something far greater than a simple bioform. It had become a symbol of the Tyranids' most terrifying truth, that they were evolving faster than humanity could learn how to kill them. And as the siege dragged on, the people of Calth came to realize that this beast was not simply a herald of the swarm. It was a manifestation of the hive mind's ceaseless hunger, wearing the face of an unkillable monster. The nightmare was far from over. As the siege of Calth dragged deeper into weeks of brutal warfare, it became clear to the defenders that Old One-Eye was not merely a monstrous presence on the battlefield. It was a turning point. Wherever the beast appeared, defenses crumbled, entire regiments disappeared. Armored columns were reduced to twisted wreckage. The planet's defenders had begun to believe that the monster was unstoppable. But amidst this growing despair, fate would place one man at the heart of a story that would echo across centuries. A man whose name is lost to history, but whose deed would define the legend of Old One-Eye. Far from the front lines, deep within the shattered ruins of Hive Magnus, a scattered group of survivors struggled to regroup after another wave of Tyranid attacks. The city had once stood as a beacon of imperial might, vast cathedrals rising alongside manufactorum towers with spires that pierced the clouds like lances aimed toward the heavens. Now those towers lay broken, their blackened skeletons looming over desolate streets filled with the corpses of defenders and civilians alike. Among the survivors was a low-ranking officer of the Astra Militarum, a man who, by all accounts, should not have still been alive. He had no grand title, no famous lineage, no powerful weaponry. His company had been destroyed days earlier, scattered in the wake of one of Old One-Eye's rampages. Since then, he had moved alone through the ruins, avoiding patrols of gaunts, keeping ahead of the encroaching Tyranid broods by sheer luck, instinct, and determination. He had witnessed the monster with his own eyes. He had seen it tear apart Leman Russ tanks like toys. He had heard the screams of his comrades as they were crushed beneath its claws. And yet, somehow he had survived. Now, stranded in the upper levels of a collapsed hab complex, he watched through a shattered viewport as the beast itself stalked the streets below. Old One-Eye moved with terrifying purpose, its immense bulk gliding through the ruins like a stalking predator. It was alone this time, no accompanying swarm, no supporting broods. The hive mind's great synapse web had thinned as Imperial forces pushed back against Hive Fleet behemoth elsewhere in Ultramar. But even cut off from the guiding will of the swarm, Old One-Eye hunted relentlessly. The man had no illusions about the danger. He should have fled. He should have remained hidden, as he had done for days. But as he watched the creature approach a nearby makeshift refugee camp where civilians huddled, something in him changed. He knew that if the Carnifex reached them, they would have no chance. There were no Ultramarines there, no tanks, no defenses. Only unarmed civilians, women, children, the wounded, huddled together and praying for rescue that might never come. He checked his weapon, a simple plasma pistol, scorched, battered, unreliable. He barely had enough charge left for a single full-powered shot. The rational part of him screamed that it was suicide. One man could not stop such a beast. One plasma shot would not bring it down. And yet, some flicker of duty burned brighter. He would not watch helplessly as more innocents were slaughtered. Moving quickly through the ruins, he climbed down broken stairwells and across precarious beams until he reached a vantage point above the street where the Carnifex moved. The beast paused, sniffing the air, its massive claws twitching as it sensed the life hidden nearby. Its single gleaming eye pulsed with cold, alien light as it scanned its surroundings. The man steadied his breathing. He crouched behind the shattered remains of a plasteel girder and brought the plasma pistol to bear, aiming carefully at the massive skull that loomed before him. He could see the grotesque patterns of scarred tissue where armor plates overlapped, thick as tank plating. But then, there, he saw it. The slight irregularity in the monster's carapace, a faint hollow near the left side of its face, just beneath one of the largest ridges. It was the eye. Though the plasma blast would only have a single chance, he understood that this was where the beast was most vulnerable, the only place where its armor had not regrown. A wound the creature had never fully healed. He steadied the pistol. The capacitors whined as they reached full charge, the weapon shaking slightly in his grip. If the plasma core failed now, it would overload and likely kill him instantly. But there was no other option. He whispered a prayer to the Emperor, and then he fired. The bolt of superheated plasma streaked through the air in a blinding arc. It struck Old One-Eye's face with pinpoint precision, exploding with a brilliant flash of blue-white energy. The plasma bored directly into the eye socket, vaporizing what remained of the Tyranid's optic nerve and burrowing into its brainstem. The Carnifex let out a roar unlike anything heard before, a sound of agony that echoed across the broken city like the tolling of a funeral bell. The creature staggered. For a moment it thrashed wildly, its massive claws smashing through nearby structures as it struggled to maintain balance. The wound smoked and hissed, burning deep within its skull. Blood, if the ichor of Tyranids could even be called such, sprayed in great arcs as the beast writhed. And then, with a final convulsion, Old One-Eye toppled. The impact shook the ground as the creature's immense bulk crashed into the ruins. Dust and debris billowed into the air, obscuring the monster's broken form. The man remained frozen for several seconds, expecting the beast to rise once more, but it did not. It lay still, its single eye now dark and lifeless. The civilians hidden nearby slowly emerged, drawn by the silence that had followed the battle. They saw the man standing above the slain monster, smoke rising from his battered plasma pistol, and for a moment they simply stared, unable to comprehend what had happened. He had done what entire regiments had failed to achieve, what no tank, no fortress, no artillery battery could manage. With one desperate shot, he had felled the unkillable monster. When Imperial relief forces finally reached the site days later, they found the massive corpse of Old One-Eye still lying in the ruins, and beside it, the exhausted, half-conscious soldier who had slain it. Records were taken, reports filed. The monster's body was left where it fell, too massive to move, too dangerous to tamper with. The ice winds of Kalth would later claim the carcass, freezing it into a silent glacial tomb. As for the man who delivered the killing blow, his name was never recorded in the grand annals of Ultramar's war histories. His deeds were acknowledged briefly in a few scattered reports, but quickly lost amidst the larger accounts of the Tyrannic War's many battles. Yet his act became the seed of legend, the unknown soldier who killed the unstoppable Carnifex, who brought down the beast that armies could not. And while his name may be forgotten, his shot ensured that Old One-Eye's name would never be. But as the Imperium would later learn, even this triumph was not the end. For what lay frozen beneath Calth's ice was not a corpse, but a nightmare waiting to awaken once more. The war for Calth slowly burned itself out. Across the shattered cities, the remnants of Hive Fleet Behemoth were finally driven off, broken by the combined might of the Ultramarines, the Astra Militarum, and the costly intervention of the Imperial Navy. What remained in the wake of the Tyranid invasion was ruin, a world scarred beyond recognition, its once glorious cities reduced to jagged bones of steel and stone. But amidst the rubble of this broken world lay a much more sinister relic, the body of Old One-Eye. When the dust of battle settled and order was gradually restored to the surviving regions of Calth, Imperial survey teams were dispatched to catalog and recover what remained. The devastation was widespread. Entire populations had been annihilated. Infrastructure had been reduced to craters and slag. And scattered across the surface, the colossal corpses of dead Tyranid bioforms still littered the landscape. Most of these were swiftly incinerated or reclaimed as biomass by the few remaining Tyranid organisms before they were exterminated. But one body remained untouched, too massive to be moved, too dangerous to approach. Old One-Eye's carcass had come to rest far from the centers of surviving habitation, deep in the planet's southern polar region. There it lay partially buried in the snow, as if even the planet itself sought to entomb the nightmare once and for all. The killing blow had left its skull blackened and partially caved in, its ruined eye socket frozen solid with jagged icicles, forming grotesque new patterns over the wound. But beneath the charred wound, its immense armored bulk remained largely intact. Its talons, still stained with the dried blood of thousands, jutted up like a monstrous monument to the horrors of the war. The initial Imperial survey teams who stumbled upon the creature's resting place approached with extreme caution. Rumors of Old One-Eye's resilience had already begun to circulate. Veterans of the siege spoke in haunted tones of how it had shrugged off wounds that would have obliterated any normal Carnifex. The soldiers who examined the frozen remains knew the stories. Some refused to go near it altogether. For days, Mechanicus Magi debated the possibility of recovering the corpse for study. Its biological secrets could offer valuable insight into the nature of Tyranid bioengineering. If its regenerative properties could be understood, perhaps the Imperium could develop countermeasures for future Tyranid invasions. But the risks were deemed too great. The creature's resilience was not fully understood. There was no certainty that it was truly dead. In the end, the Administratum made the decision that many thought wisest. The area around the creature was sealed off. The southern pole was designated a restricted zone, and the entire region was quietly quarantined. Vox traffic was suppressed, records were sealed. Only a handful of high-ranking officials even knew the precise coordinates of the beast's resting place. The months turned into years. Calth's reconstruction progressed slowly. New cities rose from the ruins. The people rebuilt their homes under the protective vigilance of the Ultramarines. And while the memory of Hive Fleet Behemoth remained fresh in the hearts of many, the terror of Old One-Eye faded into the realm of campfire tales and regimental drinking stories. Few spoke of the creature's frozen resting place, but the ice did not forget. The polar storms of Calth were relentless. Season after season, sheets of snow and ice accumulated over the monster's carcass. Winds howled across the frozen wastes, carrying with them particles of glacial dust that settled in thick layers. Over time, the Carnifex's colossal form was slowly buried. The jagged tips of its claws were eventually covered. The sharp ridge of its carapace vanished beneath growing drifts. Even the ominous blackened crater of its ruined eye disappeared into the depths of an ever-thickening glacier. Within a few decades, there was no visible sign of the nightmare that lay beneath. The icy tomb had consumed it fully, but the ice was not a place of death. Deep beneath the surface, beyond the reach of the howling winds, the conditions within the glacial prison preserved Old One-Eye perfectly. The frigid temperatures slowed cellular decay to a near halt. The absence of light, warmth, and predators allowed the dormant biological processes within its flesh to continue undisturbed. And beneath the hardened plates of its exoskeleton, something astonishing continued to occur. The Tyranids were not living creatures in the same sense as those born of natural evolution. They were weapons, organic war machines designed for adaptability and endurance. Even separated from the hive mind, severed from synaptic control, the most advanced Tyranid bioforms retained an instinctive will to survive. Within Old One-Eye's ravaged body, its regenerative organs continued to function, albeit in a state of extreme dormancy. Minute by minute, hour by hour, year by year, microscopic tissues, frozen and shattered by the plasma blast, slowly began the long process of reknitting. Vital fluids thawed and refroze with the cycles of the ice, inching closer to circulation. Synaptic nodules, damaged but not entirely destroyed, gradually reformed neural connections. It was not true consciousness, but it was not death either. It was something in between. Old One-Eye was healing. The Imperium never returned to examine the tomb. Patrols were stationed nearby, but never ventured into the heart of the glacial fields. Administratum records continued to mark the southern ice region as restricted, and in time the site faded from the collective memory of Kalth's population. Generations were born, grew old, and died without ever hearing the name Old One-Eye. But on certain nights, when the winds died down and silence settled across the snow like a heavy blanket, strange sounds could sometimes be heard. Dull thuds, cracking ice, as if something massive was shifting far beneath the frozen surface. The few guardsmen stationed at the outer perimeter sometimes reported hearing them. Some wrote off the sounds as natural phenomena. Others whispered old tales passed down from the veterans of the war, stories of a beast too stubborn to stay dead, stories of a monster that had once shrugged off entire armies, that had been felled only by an impossible shot, and even then refused to release its grip on existence. One sergeant, when asked about the strange noises, simply muttered, "You can't kill what doesn't want to die." The Administratum dismissed such stories as superstition, and indeed, for many years afterward, there were no signs of activity, no movements, no breaches in the ice. The glacier remained undisturbed, but the process continued in the dark. The Tyranids' cursed biology worked patiently, silently. Unlike humans who measure time by lifespans and generations, the Tyranid mind, even when severed, exists only to endure, to wait, to feed again. Old One-Eye slept beneath the ice, dreaming of blood. For decades, the southern ice fields of Kalth remained undisturbed. The glacial expanse, miles thick in places, swallowed any memory of the horrors buried beneath. The seasons passed, the world rebuilt, and a generation of Kalthians was raised in relative peace, knowing only fragments of the terror their parents had endured during the invasion of Hive Fleet Behemoth. Old One-Eye became a ghost story. Children dared one another to venture towards the restricted zones. Miners and traders whispered tales of the monster's frozen tomb, of how the ground would one day crack open and release the beast again. The Administratum, ever eager to suppress local superstition, redacted most records concerning the Carnifex's fate. To the wider Imperium, Old One-Eye was filed away as a statistical anomaly, slain in action during the First Tyrannic War, presumed permanently neutralized. But the Tyranids had not abandoned their monstrous creation. Deep beneath the ice, the monster's unnatural biology had not ceased its work. Far slower than any battlefield regeneration, the process was glacial in both pace and setting. Yet the biomechanical processes that governed Old One-Eye were patient. It required no conscious direction. It was simply what it was made to do. survive, adapt, return. Its neural cortex, partially cauterized by the plasma strike, had slowly rerouted damaged synaptic pathways. Layer upon layer of chitin regrew, pushing aside the frozen plasma scars with grotesque, imperfect bulges of new bone. Not a perfect repair, but sufficient for function. Even the great muscles of its colossal arms, severed and torn, reformed thread by thread in eerie, silent defiance of the grave. But regeneration alone was not what ultimately disturbed the ice above. That came from outside. Far from the polar region, Calth's resurging economy brought with it new industries, new mining ventures, and the inevitable greed of frontier profiteers. As the planet stabilized, enterprising scavengers turned their attention toward the battlefields of the Tyrannic War. The ruins of Hive Magnus, the wreckage of old strongpoints, even the crash sites of downed Tyranid bioships, all became valuable scavenging grounds for those daring enough to face the remnants of the war zone. Among these opportunists was a small crew of smugglers, criminals who called themselves the Iron Talons. They operated in the shadowed corners of Ultramar, avoiding attention from Imperial authorities, trading in forbidden relics and war spoils scavenged from Tyranid conflict zones. Rumors had reached them of the frozen carcass of a legendary Carnifex lying somewhere within Calth's southern ice wastes. If they could retrieve even part of its corpse, the genetic material would fetch unimaginable sums from unscrupulous buyers. Rogue magos biologis, black market collectors, or worse. Driven by greed, they set out across the white wilderness. Navigating by forbidden maps and corrupted data slates, the smugglers located the glacial zone. The shifting of the ice had altered the landscape, but remnants of old quarantine beacons guided their way. The cold bit into their exposed flesh as they drilled and cut through layers of ice, scanning for signs of organic mass. Days turned to weeks, and then they found it. A monstrous silhouette trapped within the crystalline depths, vast, motionless, silent. The body appeared as if caught mid-stride, its claws outstretched as though frozen in the act of reaching for some long-dead prey. What little light pierced the glacier refracted through its amber-like armor, casting grotesque shadows onto the ice walls that surrounded it. The smugglers were ecstatic. What they did not understand, what they could not comprehend, was that the process of their excavation was disrupting the fragile state of dormancy Old One-Eye had maintained. As their cutting tools sent waves of vibration through the ice, as their heating charges began to thaw solid sheets of frost, the temperature within the tomb began to rise. The warm air stirred biological processes that had slumbered for decades. Electrical pulses flickered faintly across dormant synaptic nodes. Capillaries sealed for years cracked open, releasing fresh torrents of regenerative fluids. Muscles twitched beneath layers of reforming chitin, and the beast began to stir. The iron talons pressed on, oblivious. They cut deeper into the tomb, eager to extract their prize. Thermal lances melted through final layers of ice. Robotic servitors hovered close, preparing to secure the monstrous corpse for transport. One of the smugglers, perhaps emboldened, perhaps foolish, climbed into the excavation pit to inspect the creature up close. The Carnifex's remaining eye snapped open. The activation of that eye, pulsing now with a sickly green glow, froze the man in place. It was not merely light, it was something more, a beacon of awareness, of hunger. The other smugglers shouted warnings too late as the ice cracked violently, massive sheets splitting apart as the monster heaved against its weakening prison. With a scream that shattered the frozen air, Old One-Eye tore free from its tomb. Its colossal limbs swung outward, catching two of the smugglers in a single motion, crushing them into pulp against the cavern walls. Another was cleaved in half as the beast's claws found purchase. Their blood mixed with thawing ice, pooling at its feet. The servitors, lacking instincts of fear, attempted to subdue the target with mechanical precision, but were instantly smashed into scrap as the creature's claws snapped them apart like twigs. The smugglers fled, but none would escape. Old One Eye, though weakened from its long dormancy, moved with terrifying strength. It was disoriented, enraged, and starving. Each kill seemed to fuel its instinctive drive further. The Carnifex slaughtered the entire crew within minutes, painting the excavation chamber with gore. The glacier above trembled as the monster broke through the surface, ascending into the open air beneath a black winter sky. Snow churned wildly in the storm winds as the beast roared, an unholy sound that carried for miles across the desolate plains. It was awake, alive, whole. Though Hive Fleet Behemoth was long gone, though the hive mind no longer whispered in its thoughts, Old One Eye still operated on the ancient imperatives burned into its being. Hunt, kill, destroy. Freed from the ice, it began to move, staggering at first, then finding its balance. With each breath, the cold air steamed from its maw. Its muscles flexed as it tested the strength of its limbs, fully regenerated. The great plasma scar still marked its ruined eye socket, but it had survived its death once more. Old One Eye was loose upon Calth again, and this time there would be no army waiting to contain it. Old One Eye moved through the frozen wilderness of Calth like a living force of nature, a godless thing untethered from the will of the hive mind, yet driven by instincts burned into its monstrous flesh. It no longer needed orders. Its purpose was written in every fiber of its being: to hunt, to kill, and to destroy. The southern ice fields, once its tomb, were now its hunting grounds. The creature stalked silently across the glacial wastes, its great talons sinking into the snow with every ponderous step. Frost clung to its regenerating armor plates, forming jagged icicles that hung like teeth from its towering frame. The winds howled around it, but the monster pressed forward, unaffected by the cold. It had slept long enough. Now it was awake. In the years since Hive Fleet Behemoth's defeat, Calth had grown complacent. The planetary defenses, stretched thin and reassigned to other conflicts, were largely absent from the remote southern hemisphere. The few garrisons stationed nearby were mostly token forces, small outposts meant to patrol the quarantine zones and watch for any leftover Tyranid remnants that might have burrowed underground. When the first of these outposts went silent, no one suspected Old One Eye. A routine Vox transmission from listening post Theta 12 failed to arrive. The Administratum assumed it was equipment failure, a not uncommon occurrence in the harsh southern climate. A minor team of repair technicians was dispatched by air skimmer to investigate. They never returned. Days later, a second patrol team was sent, this time with armed escort. They reached the perimeter of Theta 12 to find nothing but ruins. The fortified outpost had been torn apart with horrific violence. The exterior walls had been breached, as though something massive had simply walked straight through them. The defensive gun emplacements were little more than twisted wreckage. Inside, the bodies of the garrison were scattered across the snow, some crushed, others torn limb from limb. No survivors, no signs of Tyranid swarms. Only a trail of enormous clawed footprints leading away from the devastation into the deeper ice fields. Panic spread quickly among the planetary authorities. Within hours, orbital scans were ordered to sweep the southern pole, but the thick glacial storms interfered with the Auspex returns. Atmospheric distortions and dense snow cover made locating the creature impossible. The Magos overseeing the scans could only report faint movement signatures, large, irregular, but frustratingly inconclusive. Commanders on Calth debated how to respond. Was this truly the legendary Old One Eye, or merely another isolated Tyranid bioform left behind after Behemoth's defeat? The question remained unanswered, but the deaths at Theta 12 forced a reluctant conclusion. Something dangerous was loose, and it was hunting again. The creature pressed northward. Its predatory instincts guided it toward the nearest concentrations of life. Small agricultural settlements that had sprung up in the years following the war soon found themselves in the beast's path. Isolated farmsteads vanished overnight. Homesteads were discovered days later, ripped apart, their inhabitants missing or reduced to bloody fragments. The local Arbites suspected wild animals at first, but the scale of destruction grew more horrifying with each new attack. Witnesses, when there were any, described the same terror, a towering monstrosity twice the height of a Lehman Russ battle tank covered in dark, jagged armor. Its claws gleamed like sickles in the moonlight, and most chilling of all, it possessed only a single burning eye that glared from beneath its heavy brow. The other socket was hollow and blackened, a deep crater where its left eye had once been burned away. Word spread quickly. Old soldiers, veterans of the First Tyrannic War, recognized the description immediately. Those who had survived the original siege of Calth spoke of the Carnifex that had defied death, that had slaughtered entire battalions and destroyed fortresses as easily as a child crushes insects. Old One Eye, they called it then. And now it had returned. Fear began to take hold across the southern provinces. Refugees fled northward in droves. Entire communities abandoned their homes, clogging the few remaining transports with desperate civilians seeking safety behind the fortified cities, closer to the equator. Administratum officials issued calming statements, insisting that the situation was under control. But their reassurances rang hollow as each new report of slaughter arrived. In the remote mining settlement of Delvenar Ridge, Old One Eye struck again. The settlement had been hastily fortified once the reports of the beast's approach reached them. Local militia armed themselves with autoguns, las rifles, and whatever heavy weapons they could muster. They established barricades along the main approach, stringing lines of razor wire across the narrow ice roads. They even managed to acquire 2 ancient Chimera transports to bolster their defenses. For a moment, it seemed they might hold. Then the monster arrived. The night was silent at first, save for the wind. Then came the vibrations, a steady, rhythmic pounding that grew louder as the beast approached. The militia watched the ridge line with growing dread. Shapes moved in the darkness, and then it emerged. Old One Eye charged through the snow like a battering ram of living muscle and bone. The militia opened fire, their weapons lighting up the night, but the shots simply bounced off the creature's armored hide. The Chimera gunners fired autocannon rounds directly into its chest, but the beast barely flinched. With a roar that shook the heavens, Old One Eye slammed into the first barricade, reducing it to splinters. Razor wire snapped like thread beneath its bulk. The first Chimera was torn apart in seconds, its crew crushed inside as the Carnifex ripped the vehicle in half. The second transport tried to retreat, but its treads were caught in the snow, leaving it helpless as the monster brought its crushing claws down, flattening the vehicle in a single blow. The militia broke and ran. Old One Eye gave chase, plowing through the streets of Delvenar Ridge, leveling structures as if they were made of straw. It cornered pockets of militia, smashing their defensive positions, snapping bodies in its claws and flinging them into the air like rag dolls. Within minutes, the settlement was reduced to ruin. Fires raged where power cores had ruptured under the carnage. The air was filled with screams and the crackle of burning hab blocks. When the smoke cleared, nothing remained but shattered buildings and mangled corpses buried beneath fresh snow. It was not slaughter for sustenance. It was instinct, the drive to kill, embedded deep within its bio-coded mind. Even cut off from the hive mind, Old One Eye required no direction. The need to destroy was its only master. In the days that followed, the authorities on Calth finally recognized the scale of the crisis. This was not a random Tyranid straggler. This was the same monster thought dead decades earlier. The nightmare had returned, and it was moving north. Old One-Eye was no longer alone. As the beast rampaged northward across Calth's frozen landscapes, its passage left more than death and ruin in its wake. Something else stirred, something even the Imperial commanders failed to anticipate. Though severed from Hive Fleet behemoth, Old One-Eye remained a tyranid organism, and like all tyranids, it projected a faint biological signal, a residual synaptic pulse. Even in the absence of full hive mind control, this pulse acted as a beacon, an echo that reverberated across the psychic spectrum of the planet. And Calth, unknown to most, still harbored remnants of the Tyranid invasion. During the final battles of the First Tyrannic War, many lesser Tyranid bioforms had scattered into the wilderness. Without synaptic creatures to guide them, most perished quickly, unable to function on instinct alone. But some survived. Gaunts that burrowed deep into the planet's rocky underbelly, rippers that hid beneath the tundra, lictors that adapted to the silent forests, and genestealer strains that infested abandoned settlements and forgotten hab complexes. For decades, they remained dormant or hunted in isolated pockets, avoided by local authorities and quietly purged when discovered. But they were never fully eradicated. Now, as Old One-Eye carved a bloody swathe through Calth's southern territories, those dormant organisms began to respond. The faint echo of the Carnifex's synaptic presence called to them, igniting long-dormant instincts buried deep within their hive-bred genetics. Wherever the monster passed, scattered broods awoke and followed. It began with scattered termagant packs. Small at first, barely a dozen creatures at a time, they emerged from subterranean tunnels and ancient ruins, drawn toward the approaching alpha predator like iron filings pulled toward a magnet. These were not organized forces, not coordinated swarms. Not yet. They were primitive echoes of the greater Hive Fleet, moving purely by proximity to Old One-Eye's overwhelming dominance. As it advanced, the numbers grew. Soon Hormagaunts joined them, bounding across the frozen plains with feral energy, their scything claws glinting beneath the pale light of Calth's sun. Even isolated lictors, those stealthy ambush predators that had evaded extermination for decades, began stalking nearby, their camouflaged forms slipping between broken buildings and icy outcrops, their instincts drawn toward the growing Tyranid mass. In many ways, Old One-Eye had become an accidental synapse creature, not by design but by sheer presence, a living Tyranid beacon strong enough to gather and command feral stragglers that otherwise would have remained scattered and useless. The Imperium did not notice this development at first. Early reports continued to focus on isolated attacks, attributed solely to the Carnifex itself. But as settlements farther north began falling, the nature of the threat changed. Entire convoys disappeared, not crushed by a single set of colossal claws, but overwhelmed by waves of smaller Tyranid organisms. Outlying listening posts reported sightings of swarming gaunts, where previously there had been none. Patrol teams that set out to track Old One-Eye's movements vanished before reaching their destinations, ambushed by dozens, then hundreds of Tyranid creatures erupting from beneath the snow. Administratum scribes pored over these fragmented reports in growing alarm. What began as the re-emergence of a lone legendary beast was rapidly spiraling into a localized Tyranid resurgence, and at its center was the nightmare they once thought frozen forever beneath the ice. As the swarm grew, so too did Old One-Eye's fury. The Carnifex now moved not as a solitary predator, but as the leader of a growing pack. Its bioelectric signals reverberated stronger with each addition to its loose, feral collective. With every feeding, with every slaughter, the biomass consumed by the lesser Tyranid creatures was recycled and reabsorbed into the swarm's living ecosystem. It was not the coordinated consumption of a true Hive Fleet, but the beginnings of something far more dangerous, a rogue Tyranid cluster forming a self-sustaining node. This phenomenon was virtually unprecedented. The Tyranid hive mind typically required control from its vast orbiting bioships. Cut off from this control, most Tyranid organisms degenerated into animalistic wandering or simple self-destruction. Yet, Old One-Eye's unique genetic abnormalities, its freakish regenerative capabilities, its primal aggression, and its potent synaptic echoes allowed it to function as an improvised central point. It was becoming a pseudo-hive in its own right. On Calth, this growing swarm was dubbed by terrified locals as the Ghost Swarm. Reports from desperate outposts described eerie phenomena. Villages would wake to find their livestock butchered and their crops torn apart. Tracks appeared overnight, only to vanish into crevasses and tunnels too deep for human pursuit. Vox signals captured brief, horrifying transmissions from remote mining crews before falling silent, static punctuated by the screeches of gaunts and the thunderous roar of Old One-Eye himself. One such report, recovered from an abandoned outpost near the Valise Ridge, was later transcribed by Imperial authorities. Primary generators failing, shadows in the snow, emerging from the crevasses. Emperor, protect us. It's not alone. Repeat, it's not alone. Multiple targets. Hundreds. Oh, throne, it's here. It's here. The transmission ended with static. Panic spread quickly. Local defense forces were overwhelmed, and planetary officials scrambled to organize a response. But the realization was becoming clear to those few with access to the classified files. This was no longer simply about Old One-Eye. This was the birth of a new Tyranid threat, one that could grow into something far worse if not stopped immediately. A full deployment of Ultramarines was requested. It was not the first time Ultramar had faced Tyranids. The Ultramarines knew these enemies intimately. Veterans of Macraga and the Behemoth invasion, many of whom had fought on Calth decades earlier, immediately recognized the implications. Left unchecked, this rogue swarm could reach a critical threshold where it could draw new Tyranid bioships toward Calth, reawakening Hive Fleet synapse links and restarting the cycle of planetary consumption. Worse still, the presence of Old One-Eye suggested that this swarm had the potential to evolve new bioforms. The creature's very existence was proof of the Tyranid's terrifying adaptability. What if it produced new aberrations? What if its regenerative strain spread through the swarm? It could not be allowed. Strike teams were mobilized. Surveillance drones were dispatched to sweep the polar regions. Precision orbital bombardments were considered, though ultimately delayed for fear of driving the swarm further underground where it could grow unseen. In the meantime, the ghost swarm continued to feed. Every day that passed, Old One-Eye's horde grew stronger, and as the Ultramarines prepared to intervene once more, they understood one grim truth above all. They were no longer simply hunting the beast. They were hunting its children. The request for assistance reached Macraga within days of the escalating crisis. Though the bureaucrats of the Administratum hesitated, the chapter masters of Ultramarines did not. They had fought the Tyranids before. They had seen what happens when a swarm is allowed to gather unchecked. They knew what Calth faced. For Ultramar, this was not just a military operation, it was personal. The world of Calth was part of their domain, a jewel of the realm of Ultramar. They had defended it during the First Tyrannic War, and many still bore the scars of that brutal campaign. The stain of Hive Fleet Behemoth had never been fully erased from the world's soil. Now, echoes of that ancient horror had returned. At the head of the response force was Scout Sergeant Torias Telian. A veteran of countless wars, Telian's reputation as the finest marksman in the chapter was legend. His precision shots had felled Tyranid warriors, Orc warlords, and Chaos champions alike. But more importantly, Telian was among those rare few who had faced Old One-Eye before. Decades earlier, he had hunted the monster across the polar wastes of Kolth and nearly lost his life in the process. That hunt had ended when Telian's sniper round struck true, lodging deep within the old plasma wound that had once destroyed the Carnifex's eye. The creature had fallen into a chasm and vanished from sight, assumed finally dead. But now, standing in the war chambers of the Ultramarines' strike cruiser, Vigilant Resolve, Telian knew the truth. "It has returned," he said, his voice grim. "And this time, we will end it properly." The Ultramarines prepared their strategy with ruthless efficiency. Unlike the disorganized planetary defense forces, the Astartes did not underestimate the threat. They studied the scattered reports, examined Auspex readings, and cross-referenced survivor testimonies. They understood that this was no longer a single creature, but a feral Tyranid cluster growing under Old One-Eye's accidental leadership. The campaign was designated Operation Pale Talon, a surgical strike intended to isolate and destroy the synaptic linchpin before the swarm could fully stabilize into a new, self-sufficient hive. Precision would be critical. A full-scale planetary assault risked driving the Tyranids underground, where their biomass could grow unchecked. Instead, they would deploy small strike teams, fast, surgical, lethal, using the very environment against the creatures. The Ultramarines' strike cruiser entered high orbit above Kalth. Drop pods were prepared. Thunderhawk gunships stood ready. Tactical and scout squads reviewed data hololiths of Kalth's southern hemisphere, highlighting likely swarm concentrations. Their target was the heart of the ghost swarm, Old One-Eye itself. The descent began under the cover of a fierce snowstorm. Thick clouds shielded the orbital craft from Tyranid eyes, while the howling winds muffled their approach. Telian led a detachment of his finest scouts, warriors trained not just for battle, but for silent war. They would track the monster through the ruins and guide heavier strike forces to its lair. Touchdown was swift. Their landing zone was a jagged canyon that had once been a mining corridor during Kalth's reconstruction period. Now it was deserted, consumed by snow and creeping Tyranid infestation. Razor-sharp chitin growths pierced the ice in unnatural formations, like teeth rising from the frozen earth. Spores and biotendrils coiled along the rock faces, pulsing faintly beneath their armored boots. Telion's scouts moved through the terrain like shadows, their blue armor camouflaged beneath thick white snow cloaks. Auspex readings flickered with faint blips, scattered movement from isolated gaunts and burrowers. The scouts eliminated them silently with precise headshots, their silenced rifles firing hypersonic rounds that tore through alien skulls before they could scream. Hours passed as the team advanced deeper into Tyranid territory. The silence was suffocating. Every step forward was accompanied by the haunting groans of ice shifting beneath their feet. The storm howled above, but beneath the howling wind was a deeper, more unsettling sound, the guttural clicks of Tyranid organisms communicating in the dark. Then came the first major sighting. From a rocky outcrop, Telion's squad peered into a shallow basin below. The snow had been cleared by something massive. The ground was littered with bones, both human and animal, scattered amongst shattered vehicles and collapsed structures. Dozens of Tyranid organisms milled about, termagants, hormagaunts, even several Tyranid warriors. But towering above them all was the unmistakable bulk of Old One-Eye. It stood still, almost statuesque, steam rising from its armored hide as it exhaled in the frigid air. Its single remaining eye glowed in the dim light, scanning its surroundings with an unsettling awareness. It was not mindless, not fully. Even severed from the hive mind, the creature's instincts were too refined, too honed. It was a war machine operating on the edge of intelligence, guided by blood memory and primal aggression. Around it, the smaller tyranids gathered like loyal beasts circling their master. The sight confirmed Telian's worst fears. This was not simply a rogue beast. Old One-Eye was leading. It had become a tyrant king to these scattered bioforms, pulling them into a crude hierarchy. Telian opened a private Vox channel to his second-in-command. "We've found it," he whispered. "Mark these coordinates. Begin Phase 2. From orbit, strike teams mobilized. Within hours, a full complement of Ultramarines deployed via Thunderhawk insertion. Tactical squads landed several kilometers north of the target site, advancing with flamers and plasma weapons to drive the swarm toward a designated kill zone. Whirlwind artillery batteries were deployed on higher ground, their missile launchers ready to rain death once the trap was sprung. Telian scouts maintained visual contact, relaying every movement of the Tyranids as the encirclement closed. The Ultramarines executed their plan with ruthless precision. The initial bombardments struck at the outer fringes of the swarm, collapsing escape routes and forcing the lesser creatures inward toward Old One-Eye's position. Explosions rocked the frozen basin, sending plumes of snow and biomass skyward. Tyranid warriors roared as they fell, their towering frames torn apart by crack missiles and plasma volleys. Old One-Eye roared in response, not in fear, but in rage. It charged toward the advancing Marines, leading its creatures in a counter-assault. Gaunts swarmed forward in waves, but were cut down by disciplined bolter fire. Assault squads met Genestealers head-on, chainswords ripping through alien claws. Flamers turned the icy ground into steaming pools of melted chitin. But the Carnifex could not be slowed. Old One-Eye plowed through tactical formations, its claws slicing through ceramite armor like paper. One Marine was impaled and hurled across the battlefield. Another was crushed beneath a single, hammering blow. The beast fought with terrifying speed, its movements fueled by decades of suppressed fury. Telian saw his opportunity. From a high vantage point, he took careful aim, his sniper scope locking onto the familiar wound, the scarred eye socket that had once nearly killed the beast. His breathing slowed, his heart beat once, twice. He fired. The round struck true, driving deep into the old wound. Old One-Eye shrieked, staggering back as it clutched at its ruined face. But it did not fall. It never falls. The battle raged around them, but Telian knew this was only the beginning. The monster still lived, and this time it might take far more than one bullet to bring it down. The battlefield was chaos. The Ultramarines' trap had worked, in part. The swarm was cornered, pressed into the narrow valley under a hail of fire, but even contained, it fought with relentless fury. Waves of gaunts hurled themselves against bolter lines, their bodies piling like walls of twitching flesh. Tyranid warriors fired volleys of living projectiles from their symbiotic weapons, cutting down 2 Marines from Squad Octavian. Flamers hissed in reply, setting the snow and alien ichor ablaze, but the swarm did not falter. And in the center of it all stood Old One-Eye, a black mountain of living muscle and rage. The Carnifex charged forward, its talons wide, carving through the ranks like a battering ram. Each step shook the ground, its massive form absorbing bolt rounds, plasma blasts, and rocket impacts that would have obliterated any other bioform. Wounds that should have crippled it closed almost instantly, greenish ichor sealing rents in its thick carapace as new layers of armored chitin grew in seconds. Tactical Sergeant Maricon emptied his plasma gun directly into the beast's chest, superheated energy burning through its exposed underplate. But the monster didn't even pause. With a deafening roar, it slammed into the Ultramarine's position, one great claw scything horizontally and catching Maricon mid-step. The Marine's power armor crumpled like tin, his body flung aside like broken debris. The second claw came crashing down, pulverizing a second Marine beneath its weight. Telian watched from his elevated position as the creature rampaged, carving a path toward the artillery emplacements beyond. The whirlwinds were positioned behind the ridgeline, coordinating suppressive fire. But if Old One-Eye reached them, they would be helpless. Without artillery support, the entire assault would collapse. Through his scope, Telian could see the scar. The old wound from decades ago still marred the creature's left eye socket, a deep, blackened crater where its regenerative powers had never fully restored its optic lobe. The plasma damage had gone too deep, burning away vital tissue that could not easily be rebuilt, even by the Tyranid's monstrous biology. And yet, despite the ruin, the beast lived. Somehow it had always lived. Telian's breath slowed. He had wounded the beast once before, but not killed it. That failure haunted him. He would not fail again. The battlefield around him was collapsing. Screams of ultramarines cut through the Vox channels as Old One-Eye's gaunt packs overwhelmed the front ranks. One by one, the tactical squads were being pushed back. Even with orbital support, the monster's swarm fought like a cornered predator. "Squad Gamma, fall back to the second line," Telian ordered into his Vox. "Do not engage the primary target directly. Let it come forward." He knew the creature's behavior. Old One-Eye didn't just destroy, it hunted. It sought out strength. And right now it sensed the artillery was the key to its prey. The Carnifex barreled forward, smashing into another tactical squad that tried to block its advance. Bolter shells pinged uselessly off its thick carapace as it slammed one Marine into a frozen boulder, splitting armor and stone alike. Another Ultramarine was sliced nearly in half by a sweep of its secondary claws, his legs thrown clear from his torso. The beast climbed the slope toward the ridgeline, only a few dozen meters from the whirlwind batteries now. Telian steadied his scope. The wind howled across the ridge, buffeting his position. The snow distorted visibility, but he could still see the glowing red orb of the creature's remaining eye, burning with primal hatred. It was close, dangerously close, but he wasn't aiming for the good eye. He was aiming for the ruin. The old wound was still visible beneath the folds of regenerated tissue, jagged with warped bone and scar tissue. The only place vulnerable. The only shot that might pierce its brain. The scope's reticle narrowed. His finger hovered on the trigger. The calculations flashed through his mind. Distance, wind shear, target movement, bullet drop, the slight gravitational anomalies created by the icy valley itself. His gene-forged physiology allowed him to process it all within seconds, nerves steady, mind clear. One shot. One moment. He squeezed. The hypersonic round tore through the snowstorm, punching the wind aside like an invisible spear. The world seemed to freeze for an instant as the shot reached its target. The bullet struck directly into the gnarled eye socket. The creature convulsed. A shriek of agony erupted from Old One-Eye as the round drilled into its brainstem, punching through already weakened tissue that had never fully recovered from the plasma strike decades earlier. Its head snapped back, its claws clutched at its face, ichor spraying in thick jets from the reopened wound. The beast stumbled. Telian did not lower his weapon. The Carnifex staggered forward blindly, its massive weight dragging it dangerously close to the cliffside where the whirlwind artillery sat. The ground beneath its feet cracked and shifted under the strain. Its heavy claws raked across the ice, seeking purchase, but its bulk carried it further still. The ground gave way. With a final deafening roar, Old One-Eye toppled off the edge of the ravine, its enormous form crashing downward into the depths of a narrow canyon below. Chunks of ice and rock followed in its wake, the crash echoing like a distant avalanche. The surviving Marines froze, stunned by what they had just witnessed. Telian finally exhaled, lowering his rifle. "Target neutralized," he said quietly into the Vox. His voice, steady as ever, betrayed none of the weight behind the words. The surviving squads regrouped, bolters still raised. The artillery remained untouched. The gaunt swarms, now leaderless, began to scatter. Without Old One-Eye's presence to bind them together, their behavior reverted to erratic, mindless patterns. Ultramarines pressed forward, cleansing the remaining bioforms with disciplined volleys, driving the swarm into total collapse. By the time night fell, the battlefield was eerily silent. The mission was declared a success. Old One-Eye was gone. Its massive body vanished into the depths of the chasm. The Ultramarines sealed the ravine with controlled demolitions, collapsing tons of rock and ice over the site to bury what remained. No effort was made to recover the body. None dared. Telian remained silent during the return flight to orbit. He knew better than most. Old One-Eye had survived the impossible before, and the echoes of its roar still haunted the winds. Long after the guns fell silent, after the last of the gaunt swarms were reduced to smoking piles of chitin and ichor, after the Ultramarines returned to their fortress monastery orbiting Macraga, Calth began to breathe again. The chasm where Old One-Eye had fallen was sealed. Imperial engineers detonated precision charges along the cliff walls, collapsing tons of stone and frozen earth into the crevice. Seismic sensors confirmed there was no movement below. Vox scans picked up nothing but dead air. The mission logs were filed, casualties honored, and the system's alert level downgraded. Calth survived, but peace, as ever in the Imperium, was fragile. In the aftermath, something strange happened. Not immediately, not in the reports or the battle briefings, but in the voices of the survivors, in the grim jokes told around mess hall tables, in the hollow eyes of the few who had faced the monster and lived. Whispers, rumors, stories passed from squad to squad like a contagion. They said the Carnifex was dead, but no one had seen the body. No one had dared go down. There was no proof, only the absence of movement, the silence below, the cold comfort of assumption. Some believed Telian's shot had finally ended it. Others, veterans who had seen it shrug off wounds that should have ended anything born in this galaxy, were not so sure. These were the men who remembered Fort Resolute, who remembered the creature rising from the ruins after being blasted by tank rounds and lass fire. They had seen the old plasma wound, blackened but pulsing with life. They had heard the stories of the smugglers, the excavation, the massacre that followed. They had heard it all before, and so a new story began to take shape, not in the pages of the Adeptus Administratum, nor the data vaults of the Mechanicus, but in the oral histories shared quietly among warriors. A myth, a specter. Old One-Eye was not just a Tyranid bioform, it was a curse, and curses don't die. On the fortress world of Talasar, guardsmen stationed along the southern rim of the Maran Peninsula began to report strange disappearances. Patrols sent into the volcanic foothills failed to return. Vox scribes intercepted panicked emergency broadcasts, short bursts of static, followed by screams and crunching impacts. Scouting units were dispatched to investigate. They found nothing but blood. No signs of an organized swarm, no signs of synaptic organisms. But deep in the red clay hills, pressed into the earth like the footprint of a walking god, was the impression of something massive, something with claws. It wasn't proof, but for those who had faced Old One-Eye, it was enough. Elsewhere in Ultramar, agri-settlements far from established trade routes began to vanish. Isolated Vox beacons, usually so reliable, failed without warning. Civilian transports that passed near the desert moon of Cryon were found adrift days later, their hulls breached from the outside. No survivors, no evidence of what had attacked them. Only a scent, some said. A lingering chemical tang in the airlock corridors, something organic, something hungry. Word filtered upward slowly, past skeptical administratum scribes and under-resourced Arbites enforcers. Those who believed the reports were often dismissed, told they were overreacting. But within the ranks of the Adeptus Astartes, the rumors found fertile soil. Veterans of Calth knew better than to assume the impossible had stayed dead. And so the myth evolved. Among the PDF and Guard regiments stationed along Ultramar's southern border, it became common practice to include one specific line in after-action reports involving Tyranid bioforms, no evidence of large one-eyed Carnifex variant. A joke at first, a nod to the old legends. But as time went on, the line became more serious. It crept into formal documents, tactical assessments, redacted dossiers passed between inquisitorial agents and senior chapter sergeants. Somewhere in the heart of Segmentum Ultima, on a cogitator deep within the vaults of the Ordo Xenos, a file was updated. Subject: Carnifex Alpha Specimen, Old One Eye. Status: unconfirmed. Last visual: Calth M41.993. Likely neutralized. Potential reemergence. Probable. The Imperium had learned to fear many things, but few as much as that single recurring shadow. Old One Eye became a talisman of dread. Recruits to the Cadian 9-0 first joked that you weren't a real soldier until you'd been briefed on how to put the beast down when it comes for your tank. On Valon's Reach, priests of the local Ministorum cult warned that seeing a one-eyed beast in your dreams meant death would come before the next sunrise. In Hivespire Van Tross, children played a cruel game where one pretended to be Old One Eye, dragging a hand across the ground and roaring, while the others scattered, screaming. But the most unsettling rumors didn't come from civilians. They came from the front lines. In the years following Calth, several engagements against emerging Tyranid splinter fleets reported something strange. Amidst the masses of clawed monstrosities, soldiers swore they saw a Carnifex that stood taller than the rest. A veteran of the Praetorian 18th described it in a post-battle debrief as a monster with an old wound carved into its skull. It shouldn't have been standing, but it was. He died 2 days later in an ambush on the forge world of Ardium 9, where a minor incursion from Hive Fleet Kraken was repelled with extreme losses. Tech priests dissecting the remains of a dead Carnifex found signs of layered scar tissue over a heavily damaged cranial cavity. The wound did not match standard Carnifex patterns. It had healed poorly over a deep internal burn, one consistent with plasma weapon trauma. The specimen was destroyed within hours of that report. No official records remain, but a single Magos Logi scrawled a personal note in his leather-bound journal. I believe the legend is real. If it lives, it evolves. And if it evolves, it may already be more than legend. The Ordo Xenos took interest shortly after. Inquisitor Haldran Voke, renowned for his ruthless efficiency and deep interest in Tyranid anomalies, opened a quiet investigation into Carnifex variant sightings. He did not issue public orders, nor did he deploy his full retinue. Instead, he traveled to Calth personally, escorted only by a handful of Skitari and a Lex mechanic. He spent 2 days in the ruins of Delvinar Ridge. What he found there has never been disclosed, but when he returned to his cruiser, the Aegis Absoluta, he transmitted a single encrypted message to Terra. Target may still be active. Recommend reclassification. Persistent threat entity. Origin: Behemoth strain. Status: Immortal anomaly. The signal was classified Alpha Puritas. Only the High Lords of Terra themselves would ever read it. But the people of the Imperium don't need official reports. They have their own ways of knowing. They know deep down that some monsters are too dangerous to die, too angry, too perfect, and somewhere out in the void, beyond watchful satellites, beyond the reach of surveillance augurs, beyond the scope of tactical briefings and war room projections, something massive breathes quietly in the dark. a one-eyed shadow, scarred but whole, waiting not for orders but for the next war. Old One Eye does not die. It waits. Inquisitor Haldren Vogue stared at the data scroll unfurled before him. His bionic eye scanned the columns of information streaming from the sealed Mechanicus vaults of Calth, each line more disturbing than the last. Dates, coordinates, conflicting reports, incomplete kill confirmations, repeated resurrections. It defied every law of biology, every principle of war. Tyranids were not immortal. They were terrifying, adaptable, and nearly indestructible in the right conditions. But still, they could be killed. Destroy the synapse web, sever the hive mind, and the swarm would collapse. Even the greatest bioforms eventually perished when isolated and cut off from their fleet. It was not a matter of belief. It was fact. Old One Eye did not obey those facts. Voke's fingers hovered over the rune cipher interface as he pulled up forbidden archives from the Magos biologists' research conclaves. He cross-referenced field autopsies from numerous battle zones, Macrage, Tyran Primus, Valhalla, even small skirmishes in the Halo stars. The evidence was there, not complete, not absolute, but insistent. There were more than a dozen separate sightings. Always a Carnifex, always a plasma-scarred left eye socket, always a creature whose wounds should have ended it, but didn't. The Tyranid's capacity for regeneration had long been documented. Even standard bioforms could recover from trauma at speeds that defied human medical science. But what the Adeptus Mechanicus had observed from Old One Eye bordered on the impossible. Its regenerative systems did not merely heal, it rebuilt. Entire nerve clusters reknitted, bone plates regrew from nothing. Organ failure was reversed at cellular levels. One archived file recorded the dissection of a minor Carnifex specimen recovered on Kryptos, which bore a partial resemblance to Old One Eye's known injuries. The Magos dissecting it had described clusters of overgrown myogenic catalyst organs embedded throughout its body, redundant biological factories constantly generating new tissue. These catalyst clusters, unique even among Tyranids, were believed to be the reason Old One Eye could return from wounds that would utterly obliterate its kin. An aberration, the Mechanicus labeled it. A genetic fluke. Voke was not so certain. He flipped to the next encrypted file, a captured analysis from a Genestealer cult cell uncovered on Gaius Quintus. Their crude, heretical scriptures spoke in reverent tones of the chosen of the devourer, whose flesh cannot die. Sketches found among their artifacts depicted a towering Carnifex with a single burning eye towering over its kin as an avatar of their false god. This, too, was not coincidence. What disturbed Voke most was the growing evidence that Old One Eye's regenerative anomaly might not have been an accident at all. He tapped several command runes, bringing up bioengineering models from the first encounters with Hive Fleet Behemoth. The initial bioforms, Genestealers, Hormagons, Warriors, Carnifexes, all followed recognizable evolutionary templates. Yet Old One Eye exhibited traits that predated the refinements seen in later fleets like Kraken and Leviathan. It was older, not in a sense of age, but of purpose, a prototype, a test organism. The hive mind constantly experiments with its own biomass, absorbing and modifying new genetic material from each conflict. It evolves not in generations, but in moments. Each battle is a laboratory, each prey species an opportunity. Voke theorized that Old One Eye might have been an early experiment in hyper-regenerative bioform design, a failed, unstable prototype that the hive mind never fully replicated, at least not yet. Perhaps it was too unstable to mass-produce. Perhaps its regenerative systems interfered with the tight synaptic control the hive mind preferred to maintain. Or perhaps the strain mutated so wildly after losing its fleet that it became something outside even the hive mind's intent. Either way, it had survived where others perished, and it had done so without the hive mind's guiding hand. This fact disturbed the Inquisitor most of all. Tyranids, as terrifying as they were, remained predictable under certain rules. They required the hive mind to function at their highest capacity. Without it, they degenerated into wandering beasts. But Old One-Eye had proven otherwise. Isolated for decades, it had not merely survived, it had led feral Tyranids. It had gathered a swarm. It had learned. A Carnifex capable of independent leadership was a horror the Imperium was ill-equipped to face. Voke stood from his lectern and crossed the chamber toward the sealed cryovault where his personal research notes were stored. His cybernetic scribe skull hovered behind him, softly humming as it recorded his words for classified transmission. Designation: Old One-Eye. Function: persistent anomaly within Tyranid biosphere. Conclusion: subject exhibits biologically impossible regenerative capacity, anomalous synaptic independence, and self-sustaining leadership over non-synaptic bioforms. Hypothesis: either a rogue mutation or an unintentional consequence of hive mind experimental evolution. The skull chimed softly. "Shall I transmit your findings to the Ordo Strategos, my lord?" Voke paused. "No," he whispered. "Not yet." He turned toward the vaulted star map displaying Hive Fleet Leviathan's current positions. There, on the far eastern fringe of the galactic disk, Leviathan spread like a cancerous wound across Imperial space. Its tendrils were already adapting newer bioforms, faster Carnifexes, more heavily armored beasts, even regenerative capabilities that echoed Old One-Eye's unique resilience. Were they converging on the same design? Was Old One-Eye not a failed experiment, but a preview of what was coming? The notion sent a cold chill through him. What if Old One-Eye was not alone? What if it had succeeded where others failed, and its traits were now filtering into new strains? What if the hive mind, learning from this early prototype, was preparing for a future war in which entire broods of unkillable Carnifexes would thunder across the stars? The implications were apocalyptic. Voke composed his thoughts carefully. Eventually, his reports would reach the High Lords of Terra. Perhaps they would listen. More likely, they would classify the data under the vast mountain of unsolved Tyranid mysteries, forever filed under anomalies, never fully understood. But for those on the ground, the guardsmen in their trenches, the Astartes in their drop pods, the civilians watching the skies with dread, the myth would persist. Old One-Eye, a monster that did not require the hive mind, a predator that had outlived its own war, a template for what might come next. While the Imperium's commanders, inquisitors, and magi debated Old One-Eye's origins, while military archives classified the beast as a persistent anomaly, something far darker was taking shape beneath the surface of Ultramar. In the forgotten underhives, amidst the collapsed ruins left by the First Tyrannic War, a new faith was growing. They called themselves the Behemoid Undercult. It began, as such heresies often do, in whispers. A handful of surviving Genie-Stealer hybrids, too few to sustain a full cult, hidden from Imperial purges after Hive Fleet Behemoth's initial invasion. Starved of the psychic link to the hive mind, these lost hybrids should have withered or descended into feral madness. But they didn't. Instead, they found something to fill that void. A new object of worship. Old One-Eye. The earliest members of the Behemoid Undercult had been there on Calth, when the first great Tyranid assault fell upon the planet. Some had seen the Carnifex with their own eyes, watched it obliterate fortifications, crush tanks, and rise time and again from wounds that should have slain any living thing. In that monstrous resilience, they saw not merely a weapon of war, but something holy, a divine avatar of the great devourer, proof of the hive mind's eternal supremacy. Even severed from the collective, even without synapse control, it endured. It persisted. It could not die. It was not a beast, they whispered. It was a god. The behemoid undercult grew slowly in the shadows, hiding within the decaying industrial sectors of Calth's lower spires. They coiled like parasites beneath the feet of the rebuilding loyalists. Disguised as laborers, manufactorum workers, and servitors, they recruited quietly. The disaffected, the desperate, the bitter, all found comfort in the cult's promises. And they taught a simple creed that when the one-eyed god rose again, the great devourer would follow. The Tyranids would reclaim their children, and all who had shown faith would be reborn in the glorious feeding. The cultists' reverence bordered on fanatical obsession. They carried crude idols, small hand-carved effigies of the Carnifex with a single gleaming gemstone in place of the right eye and a charred hollow for the left. Ritual scarification was common. Many followers willingly gouged out their own left eye, mimicking the monster's disfigurement as an act of devotion. The highest-ranking priests, or speakers of the Maw, underwent full surgical mutilations. Chitinous implants, illegally acquired from scavenged Tyranid bio-relics, were grafted onto their bodies, giving them a grotesque, hybridized appearance somewhere between man and monster. They were no longer simply genestealer remnants. They were something far more dangerous, a new form of heresy, one that mixed Tyranid biology with fanatical worship. The Imperium, for a time, remained ignorant. The Adeptus Arbites patrolled the upper levels, enforcing imperial order. The Adeptus Mechanicus restored manufactorums and starports. The Ecclesiarchy rebuilt their cathedrals and preached the Emperor's light. None of them looked too closely beneath their own feet, but the rot was spreading. The undercult grew bold enough to perform public rites in hidden chambers, deep beneath the reactors that powered Calth's hive cities. They spoke in their sermons of the coming rebirth, where the one-eyed god would rise from ice and earth to cleanse Ultramar of the weak. They offered sacrifices, both animal and human, feeding bioorganic slurry into hidden vats where stolen Tyranid biosamples gestated. They were trying to create something new. Not content with waiting for their god to return, the behemoid undercult sought to accelerate his coming. Their crude understanding of Tyranid bioengineering allowed them to experiment in primitive spawning chambers, heretical attempts at replicating Carnifex tissue using fragments of Old One-Eye's shed carapace, stolen from ancient battlefields long abandoned by the Administratum. Most of these experiments failed, producing only tumors of writhing, mindless flesh, but a few showed terrifying potential. Small, hybridized Tyranid bioforms, mockeries of true Carnifexes, were hatched and housed in secret. These creatures, barely functional, pulsed with a fragment of synaptic energy. The undercult viewed these as divine offspring, the first spawn of the one-eyed god. It was during one such secret ritual that the cult first attracted the attention of the wider Imperium. A group of scavenger techs from a Mechanicus maintenance guild stumbled upon one of the undercult's breeding chambers. What should have been a routine repair turned into a massacre. The techs were butchered by the malformed creatures, their flesh stripped for further feeding. The Adeptus Mechanicus initiated a quiet investigation. What they uncovered shook the local Magos biologist to his core. Forbidden Tyranid biomatter, surgical experiments in biohybridization, ritual texts written in a perverse blend of High Gothic and Xenos glyphs. Worst of all, genetic markers traceable back to Old One-Eye itself. The cult was rooted not just in heresy, but in biological heresy, an abomination of Tyranid flesh twisted by human hands. Word spread swiftly. The Inquisition was summoned. When Inquisitor Lord Kiras Velor arrived on Calth, he authorized immediate exterminatus protocols for any discovered undercult hives. Purge teams armed with flamers, meltas, and toxin gas flushed the lowest levels of the Hive cities, burning out nests of hybrid cultists. Arbite's shock troops sealed off entire sectors. No mercy was shown. Yet, even under the hammer of the Emperor's justice, the undercult clung to its faith. Those captured alive muttered their final prayers to the one-eyed god as they burned, declaring that their master would rise again. Some even welcomed death, believing their souls would be consumed and reborn in the great devourer's galactic hunger. The behemoid undercult was largely broken, but not erased. Pockets of survivors fled into deeper tunnel networks beneath Calth's southern hemisphere. Some scattered to other worlds within Ultramar, smuggling their heretical texts and stolen biosamples aboard freighters bound for distant mining colonies. There, they whispered, new seeds would take root. Inquisitor Valor classified the threat as continuing contamination risk, tier Hereticus/Xenos hybridization. He reported to the Ordo Xenos High Council. While Hive Fleet Behemoth was defeated, its spiritual echoes linger dangerously. The cult of the one-eyed god proves that Tyranid infection is not purely biological. Ideological contamination represents a new front in this war, one more insidious than even genestealer infiltration. We face not only the Tyranid species, but a heretical faith devoted to its image. And though the cult's power was broken on Calth, the myth remained. Old One-Eye was no longer simply a Tyranid. It was becoming something far worse, a god. For years, silence followed. The destruction of the behemoid undercult was marked as a victory in the endless struggle against heresy. The reports filed, the tunnels sealed, the cultists burned or executed. Their whispered prayers to the one-eyed god were believed silenced forever. Calth moved on, or at least pretended to. Administratum officials declared the planet stable once more, a beacon of resilience within Ultramar. But rumors continued to swirl like black currents beneath calm waters. Merchant captains spoke of ships disappearing near fringe systems. Mining outposts reported missing crews, unexplained structural collapses, and organic residue left behind, always dismissed as isolated incidents or minor Tyranid remnants from past conflicts. The Ordo Xenos received fragmentary vox captures of mutilated crews and shattered void ships, but nothing substantial enough to mobilize a full-scale investigation. Then came the invasion of the Cryptus system. When Hive Fleet Leviathan surged from the galactic southeast, it shattered dozens of worlds. Planets long thought secure were reduced to bone and ash. The pattern of Leviathan's assault was terrifying in its precision, fragmenting, adapting, converging. But within the monstrous tide of Xenos bioforms, something peculiar was sighted. It was on the war-torn world of Tartaros that Old One-Eye revealed itself once more. The planet had once been a vital staging ground for the Cadian 101st and multiple Astra Militarum regiments stationed along Ultramar's eastern flank. The garrison believed they were prepared for Leviathan's assault. Trenches were dug, artillery emplacements constructed, shield generators hummed with protective energy. When the first spores rained down from orbit, the defenders met them with fierce resistance. Hundreds of thousands of Tyranid organisms were slaughtered in the opening engagements, Hormagaunts cut down by heavy bolters, Carnifexes obliterated by Baneblade squadrons, Genestealers purged in brutal tunnel fights beneath the fortress walls. But then the ground shook. The defenders watched in horror as a new horror emerged at the forefront of the Tyranid charge, a towering Carnifex unlike any other. Its black carapace glistened in the unnatural light of Tartaros's twin moons. Its enormous claws flexed as it charged headlong into Imperial lines, and in its face, unmistakably, the great cratered socket where its left eye should have been. The one-eyed beast had returned. No longer isolated, no longer wandering. This time it led Leviathan's brood like an ancient warlord returning to his throne. Cadian heavy weapons teams turned their guns toward the creature immediately. Dozens of Laskinins converged on its massive form, their concentrated beams slicing across the charging Carnifex. The creature's carapace smoked and cracked under the withering assault, but it did not slow. Artillery batteries behind the trench lines launched volley after volley of high-explosive shells. The ground erupted into geysers of flame and shrapnel. From orbit, orbital defense platforms fired macro laser beams directly into the center of the Tyranid advance. Still, the beast pressed on. The closer it came, the more it resembled something almost mythological, as though the living nightmare of 1,000 soldiers' campfire stories had burst into reality. Its great claws snapped tank barrels in half like twigs. Its bulk smashed aside bunkers reinforced with adamantium plating. Chimera transports were flattened beneath its stampeding legs. Even as the beast's wounds reopened, new flesh grew in their place. Its regenerative organs pulsed visibly beneath its half-burned exoskeleton, oozing green ichor that congealed into hardened plates seconds after being pierced. This was no mindless brute. This was biological immortality given motion. Cadian lines broke. Plasma guns overheated and exploded in the hands of desperate guardsmen. The few remaining Baneblades concentrated their fire on the monster, but the Carnifex crashed into their formation like a thunderbolt, toppling one of the super-heavy tanks with a single, titanic swipe of its crushing claws. The vehicle detonated in a chain reaction that consumed an entire block of the forward defenses. Old One-Eye did not stop. With the forward defenses shattered, the beast crashed into the void shield generators, stationed behind the main lines. These generators were the last hope for the Cadian defenders, protecting the city's command centers from both the Tyranid onslaught and the solar flares that frequently ravaged Tartaros's unstable atmosphere. Massive claws punched through the reinforced walls of the void shield facility. Metal groaned, sparks erupted from failing power conduits as the Carnifex tore the generators apart with mechanical precision. Its smaller feeder claws ripped through the interior chambers, reducing control panels to twisted scrap. The void shields collapsed. Tartaros's sky, already turbulent with plasma storms, erupted as a massive solar flare washed over the planet. Without the protective shielding, the atmosphere became saturated with lethal radiation. Trenches filled with Cadian soldiers were instantly incinerated as waves of electromagnetic fury scoured the surface. Entire regiments vanished in moments. Those not killed by the storm were consumed by the advancing Tyranid horde that followed in Old One-Eye's wake. Hive Fleet Leviathans swept across Tartarus like a living flood, devouring what remained of the planet's biomass. Tartarus was lost, and in the heart of that massacre stood the creature that had haunted Ultramar for nearly a century. Old One-Eye was no longer an isolated nightmare of Calth's southern pole. It had found its way back into the wider Tyranid swarm. Somehow, despite decades of exile, despite the loss of Hive Fleet Behemoth, despite every effort by the Imperium to kill it, it had returned to the embrace of the Hive mind. Or perhaps it had never truly been separated at all. The question that haunted the Inquisition afterward was how it had crossed the void. No recorded splinter fleet had passed through Ultramar's southern border before Leviathan arrived. No mycetic spores had survived from Behemoth's initial defeat. And yet, Old One-Eye had reappeared at the forefront of Leviathan's swarm, as if it had been waiting for this very moment. Some theorized that a dormant spore containing its genetic material had been carried aboard a rogue bioship, hidden in hibernation until Leviathan's psychic call awoke it. Others speculated that it had hitched a ride in one of Leviathan's initial tendrils, a living relic of Behemoth, absorbed and reborn into the new fleet. The truth remains unknown, but one thing was certain. Old One-Eye was not simply a rogue bioform any longer. It was part of the Hive again, its unique regenerative adaptations now fully integrated into Leviathan's monstrous genetic memory. And as Leviathan continued its galactic spread, reports of Carnifexes exhibiting increased regenerative abilities multiplied. Entire broods emerged, bearing some echoes of Old One-Eye's horrific resilience. It was no longer just a beast, it was a blueprint. The nightmare was spreading. The war zones of the 41st millennium are littered with the remains of Tyranid monstrosities. Millions upon millions of bioforms have fallen under the relentless firepower of the Astra Militarum, the Astartes, the Adeptus Mechanicus, and countless other defenders of the Imperium. Their corpses rot and dissolve into biomass, recycled by the Hive Fleets or burned away by purging fire. Most are forgotten, catalogued only in the endless archives of Administratum data scribes as casualties in battles too numerous to count. But not Old One-Eye. It remains. It has always remained. Even as Hive Fleet Leviathan pushed deeper into the galaxy, as splinter fleets fractured and reformed across Segmentum Ultima and the Eastern Fringe, stories of a singular Carnifex kept resurfacing. These were not idle rumors passed between frightened soldiers or bored deckhands. These were field reports, eyewitness accounts from battle-hardened commanders who had seen the impossible with their own eyes. On the world of Thalax II, during a brief but savage splinter fleet assault, Mechanicus Skitari captured Auspex footage of a Carnifex leading the vanguard. It was faster than any variant previously catalogued, its heavy carapace glistening with living armor that shimmered in the refracted light of Thalax's dying sun. But what caught the Magi's attention most was its face, a hollow, scorched cavity where its left eye had once been. 3 weeks later, Thalax II was devoured. On the jungle death world of Zarnis, Katakan regiments faced a sudden incursion of Tyranid organisms believed to be remnants of a broken splinter fleet. Veteran scouts, trained to recognize every known Tyranid bioform, encountered a solitary Carnifex deep in the vine-choked valleys of the southern continent. They reported that the creature bore a familiar disfigurement, an old wound, partially healed but unmistakable. Only a single survivor was recovered. His final Vox transmission, barely audible through static, carried his last words. "It's here. It found us. The eye never heals. Emperor, save..." Zarnis too fell silent within days. The pattern repeated itself across multiple sectors, isolated worlds struck by minor Tyranid forces, almost always preceded by the appearance of a one-eyed Carnifex, sometimes alone, sometimes leading a smaller feral swarm, but always with the same dreadful consistency, regenerative abilities that defied every known biological limit. The Ordo Xenos, once cautious, could no longer deny what was happening. Old One-Eye was no longer a single organism. It had become a phenomenon, a genetic strain. Wherever its flesh was consumed or absorbed into the hive mind's great genetic pool, its adaptations spread, like a curse carried forward by Leviathan's evolution. New Carnifex broods emerged with enhanced regenerative cores. Wounds that once would have crippled them became meaningless. Even under concentrated heavy weapons fire, these Carnifexes refused to fall, pushing through injuries that should have annihilated any creature. The nightmare was multiplying, and yet, even among these newer breeds, reports continued to surface of the original. The one, the true, not a copy, not an inheritor. Old One-Eye itself. It seemed to phase in and out of conflict zones, appearing on battlefields hundreds of light years apart, as though slipping through the Hive's network like a phantom of living flesh. On some war fronts, it appeared leading vast Tyranid vanguards, tearing apart Titan engines with its claws. On others, it prowled alone, striking isolated convoys and void stations, leaving behind only ruin and silence. No one understood how it moved. Unlike typical Tyranid creatures, it displayed no need for continuous synaptic control. It could vanish from a war zone and reappear years later, fully healed, fully aware. Entire regiments were dedicated solely to its elimination whenever it was sighted. Strike cruisers were dispatched, orbital bombardments authorized without hesitation. Each time it was struck down, each time it returned. Inquisitorial kill teams recovered only fragments of its shredded carapace or pools of congealed ichor, but never a body. Magos biologists theorized that its regenerative systems were so extreme that even catastrophic damage was insufficient to prevent recovery. Even partial remnants could regrow into a fully functioning organism given enough time and raw biomass. The theories grew more desperate, more heretical. Some whispered that Old One-Eye was no longer bound by the simple mechanics of Tyranid biology, that its regenerative cycle had become a form of perpetual self-reconstruction, an endless loop of death and rebirth more akin to a warp-spawned abomination than a product of natural evolution. Others, more superstitious, whispered that it was not flesh and bone at all, but the hive mind's vengeance incarnate, an immortal executioner, a predator made eternal. The fear spread throughout the ranks of the Imperium's defenders. In training camps across Segmentum Ultima, fresh Astra Militarum recruits were briefed on Tyranid weaknesses, but always with a dark-aside warning of exceptions to the rule. Veteran sergeants told their soldiers, "If you see a Carnifex with one eye, run. It will not fall like the others." The Astartes chapters, who had fought in the early Tyrannic Wars, understood this better than most. Among the Ultramarines, the tale of Old One-Eye remained etched into their chapter's history, spoken with equal parts rage and reverence. Some veterans, like Scout Sergeant Torias Tellian, had faced it more than once, and lived to carry the weight of those encounters. When asked if the beast had been destroyed after Tartaros, Tellian reportedly answered only, "It falls, but it never dies." Even among the Inquisition's highest circles, Old One-Eye's file was given special designation. Not simply a Tyranid organism, but a persistent anomalous threat entity. Not a target to be eliminated, but one to be contained, monitored, and above all, feared. The Adeptus Mechanicus studied what little genetic material they recovered from its offshoot broods, marveling and recoiling at the complexity of its regeneration patterns. Some argued that if the Imperium could unlock the secret of Old One-Eye's regeneration, mankind could master healing beyond any form known. Others warned that to tamper with such knowledge was to risk contamination of humanity's genetic purity, and so, across the millennia, Old One-Eye has transcended its original purpose. It is no longer simply a Tyranid. It has become a symbol, a nightmare whispered across worlds that have never even seen a hive fleet, a cautionary tale for commanders, and a lingering reminder of the Tyranids' horrifying capacity to evolve beyond comprehension. But above all else, it endures. In the shadows of distant battlefields on worlds long since abandoned, in the void between stars where the hive fleets roam, Old One-Eye still moves, waiting, hunting, rising once more whenever the galaxy dares to think it is finally dead, because in the grim darkness of the far future, Old One-Eye never dies.